The Data Community with Lee Brownhill.
The Azure and DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using the latest in .NET, Azure, AI, and DevOps. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. The show is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm. Find them at www.clearmeasure.com. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. A quick announcement. I'm actually hiring a software engineer, and so if you'd like to work with me, it doesn't matter how many years in the industry or experience level. I'm just looking for somebody who's really, really good, eats, sleeps, and breathes .NET and the whole Microsoft development ecosystem. So send me an email. I'm easy to find, or you can go to our careers page on clearmeasure.com. The guest for today is Lee Brownhill, and he's a Principal Cloud DBA at Cloud Rede with deep expertise in SQL Server performance tuning and automation. He has years of experience across Azure and AWS, and he helps clients optimize their cloud data platforms. His journey began in IT support. It quickly evolved into a passion for SQL Server that led him through different roles as a Production and Developer DBA, and now he's a trusted consultant, and he's known for making systems run faster and smarter. He's also a Redgate Community Ambassador. He's a regular speaker at SQLBits and Data Relay, and he once spent a transformative week learning from T-SQL legend Itzik Ben-Gan. And whether on-prem or in the cloud, his mission is pretty simple: make SQL Server shine. And we can find his blog on leebrownhill.com. Lee, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thank you for the excellent introduction. I'm good, thanks. I'm excited to be on the show. I've listened to many of your shows in the past and really enjoyed them. So to be a guest is a great honor.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm glad you're here. We talk about all kinds of software related topics on the show. And so I'm so excited to kind of dive deep into a data topic and SQL Server, because I think everybody has, issues with SQL Server performance and data. But before we kind of get into that, I'd just like to go back in time. And are there points in your career that we can highlight where maybe it was a turning point that kind of steered you, where you realized, I love focusing on databases and data? I went the coding route. And do you remember, was there a turning point where you said, oh man, this is fun, I'm going in this direction?
Absolutely. So I think, like a lot of people, I started off in general IT support and hardware support at a particular company I was working at. And then one day they upgraded their ERP system to Microsoft Dynamics NAV at the time, quite an old system now. And of course, the back end of that is a SQL Server. It was that first SQL Server. And suddenly I got very interested in that one particular server, and I didn't want to do the rest of my responsibilities anymore. It was just this mystery box to me. And the more I learnt about it, the more I wanted to know about it. And I had a project given to me, much to my dismay at the time. But I had a project given to me which was ultimately to transform and migrate all of the company's current reporting, which was all kinds of data sources across the offices. So you had anything from Excel files to Access files to all sorts of things. And I had to convert and migrate those into SSRS, which was suddenly available to us. Obviously, it's shown its age now, but and that was my pivotal point, because that's probably one of the most fun, exciting projects I'd ever done to that date. So lots of just data gathering, lots of resource gathering, understanding, working with people to understand what they actually needed. And then, transforming that into SQL Server SSRS reports. So that was a very big pivotal moment in my life where I realized I want to do more of this, and I wanted to know more about the internals and what actually, what's going on in the database. So I suddenly applied for, I started applying for a bunch of DBA jobs, and very quickly realized just because I can write a few SQL scripts, I am not a DBA, or I wasn't at the time. So I did a lot of training and a lot of reading up from the amazing data community that existed that was, again, a shock to me. So eventually, got into a DBA role. But thinking back, that was a pivotal moment for me where I realized working with data was for me, and that's what I wanted to do. And I've never really looked back since all those years ago, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, it's huge, and anybody who's working on software has to do a little or a lot. And of course, if the system is larger, it ends up being a lot, and you got complicated bits, and then that one table or many, which is many millions of records. So if we were to, I'm going to ask you some child's play questions. You've gone deep, but there's a lot of more and more young programmers who don't work in a large organization that may have someone dedicated and focused on databases. But guess what? They've got a connection string to a database, or maybe they had to create a database schema. And the world is different from. I haven't gone deep like you, but I remember working on a SQL Server cluster. Whereas now, if I put it in Azure, well, there's a whole lot of things I'm never going to do again. But say someone's just created an Azure SQL database in the cloud. Mm-hmm. And they created some tables, so they're not working on the SQL Server cluster, but they're still making schema decisions.
Yep.
There's some common mistakes that they're still making. What do they need to think about?
One thing. So there's a whole slew of common anti-patterns, is what we call them, in the database world. So these anti-patterns. So general coding constructs such as, I could go on forever about them all, but there's a common misconception that I've worked with a lot of .NET developers in the past, and they just love loops and iterative mechanisms because it works really fast in .NET, and it doesn't work the same way in SQL. So one of the most common things is it's quite easy, or was when I was working alongside .NET people, was that, I could tell who's wrote this sort of procedure or this SQL script, because where you didn't necessarily need a loop or a looping mechanism, there would be one very often. So SQL loves set-based operations, right? So you just go in, you get what you need, and you can get it as one hit, But it's this rebar, which we call row by agonizing row, which is the most common one I used to see. So because it works really well in other languages, right? And it is really fast and really optimal, but it doesn't work the same way in SQL Server, and causes a lot of unnecessary overhead and reading, and will start adding to your log file unnecessarily, and all these things you want to really avoid and try to go down the set-based route. So if I had to pick one, that's the first one that springs to mind. Is I could actually kind of almost tell who had wrote SQL in my team at the time, because I could certainly sort of half between the two teams anyway. So it's quite an interesting one.
Awesome. And in your work, you go into client scenarios where they have some performance problem. They say, "Oh, doc, it hurts right here," and they don't know why, and you have to go in and you kind of have to start inspecting to go figure out what might be wrong. What's your thought process? How do you begin an inspection for some of these performance problems? Yeah,
well, like you say, very often it hurting there is a symptom of something, right? It's not the problem. So that's the first thing you have to keep in mind. And I actually, when I was working on a sort of frontline support, I was the person people were calling up for these priority one issues. I actually had a tried and tested checklist of things I would, go and approaches, because there's so many settings, there's so many things you can check initially that I used to get overwhelmed when I was quite new to the SQL Server world, because there are literally so many things that it could be. So you have to really take a step back first. And there was a post done by Brent Ozar many, many years ago that stuck with me. And he actually said you should have a tried and true sort of checklist of things you go for and go through. And at first you start to sort of say, okay, well, you got to categorize the issue in sort of a 4 or 5 levels realistically. It's like, number one, is the server down? That's your first one. Is the server down? It doesn't get any more severe than that, right?
Is it plugged in?
Exactly. Number two is, is the server going to go down in the next sort of 10, 15, 20 minutes? And they gradually get further down there, right until, Bob's report is taking longer than normal. That's the sort of lowest level sort of priority. Right. So you have to instantly categorize it from your own sort of experience and just sort of what you see initially. So that's the first thing I would always do, is sort of try and categorize it and understand, well, do I need to do something now? Do I need to do something within 20 minutes? And do I need to do something by tomorrow morning, etc.? So at least you can sort of set expectations for your client and stakeholders about what actually needs doing right now. So yeah, it's quite abstract how I approach that initially, really. So I take a big step back and look at it a bit more holistically and categorize it. And then you can start drilling down. That will steer you in your own direction once you've categorized it correctly about, the actual priority of the issue, rather than, because everybody has a problem and it's always a priority one, right? When it comes to your door, or it used to be for me. So, it could be, Bob's report is taking longer than normal. And that's really important to Bob, but it's not going to cause the business any immediate pain or danger. So it's always about setting expectations, really.
So you've developed this checklist kind of through your experience over time of things to check first versus, you could have 1,000 items just to check everything. Have there been themes that have emerged over time where it seems like multiple people make similar types of mistakes?
Yes, and there's definitely a theme. So one of the first things, if it was a critical, I've got to do something now, one tool that I think every DBA will know instinctively is called SPU is active. And that tool, that open source tool, was developed by Adam Mechanic. Excuse me. And that what you can do with that tool is you can run it on an instance and it will show what's in flight now, what processes are running now, are there any blocking issues happening right now? And speaking of such things, one of the most common things in one of my roles I would see would be because everybody had access to all the servers, right? All the developers, and rightly or wrongly, that's how it was when I first started. And very often you would get somebody thinking, well, I can just run this in production, right? As long as I wrap it in a transaction. But the problem is very often that user or users would forget to close that transaction or roll back that transaction. So instantly you've got a connection to your database that's holding various locks across all different tables. And then a legitimate business request comes in from, the application front end, and all of a sudden it can't actually read the table data it needs to because there's an exclusive lock by the other person who's got that transaction open. So yeah, you have to kind of go in with a smoking gun and just sort of get rid of these active sessions. And back in the day, before various enhancements in later SQL Server versions, that could take a long time as well, because they would go and run a query. It would go multi-threaded beautifully across, 20 cores, and it would be running for an hour. And then you have to roll back, and then rollbacks are single-threaded. So So then the time and the expectancy of that to actually release those locks could be times 20 the amount of time it would actually be running for. You don't have that same sort of problem in later versions because there's things like accelerated database recovery. I think it came out in 2019, which alleviates a lot of that pain, thankfully, because those were dark days when you had to roll back these transactions that had been going multi-threaded across this monster server for an hour. Yeah. And then you have to roll it back single-threaded, and you could shut the server down, right, and it will just pick up back where it left off once it's back up. So that was a common one until we got some good security controls in place. But when I first joined that role, it was kind of the Wild West in terms of who had access to critical servers, production servers. Everybody had access and elevated access to these production databases. So we got that locked down eventually, but initially it was some dark days.
Yeah. my mind wants to simplify all these things, and I always like to push computers to the side. I'm thinking of how we've treated databases where we created these big rooms of file cabinets full of drawers with all the file folders and the data and everything, a piece of paper, and everybody is walking around and everybody has full access to everything in there. And you go in and you're looking for the case file for, imagining a detective at a police force looking at the case file for Joe Bob, who's suspected of murder. It's like, where's the file? It's gone. It's like, it should be right here because somebody else. And so you mentioned that you got a lot of people that have elevated access to this big database server today. For the people who are thinking about how to create a new database, or they're making software decisions as well, are databases generally too big? Should we be segmenting them a little bit more, or how do you think about an optimal database structure or segmentation in 2025?
I think some of the core rules and guidelines still are true and will always be true. So the first thing I would think about if I was designing a new database would be, obviously, if it's relational database, I would want to make sure it's normalized correctly to probably, there's various forms of normalization right up until, I think, 4th or 5th is the last one. But the process of normalization ensures that you don't get duplicated data realistically throughout your database, and make sure your data is has integrity across those tables. So the first thing, and I think it will always be the case with the relational databases, would be to go through that process of normalization. And that's not cool, it's not exciting, but it's so pivotal in those early days, because you will end up with a database that is flooded with repeated redundant data. And then that brings its own pain and troubles when you start querying that data, when you have to start updating that data, when you have to start indexing it for optimal processes. So normalization is a must for relational databases, and I would be very surprised if any database professional would ever argue against that realistically, because it's just so pivotal.
And do you what's your minimum? Do you go for the Boyce Cod normal form, which is what, 3.5, somewhere in between 3 and 4?
Yeah, I think so. I think 3 is the minimum for me realistically. So you've got to make sure that you are, because it's all about preparation, right? Nothing was built on shoddy foundations, or if the base isn't good, anything you build on top of that is only going to be subject to the poor design of the base. So you've got to make sure that your baseline is solid. And I think that's the key. You've got to make sure that.
But what do you think? There's so many big databases out there where multiple systems have the connection string to the production database.
Yeah.
Is that a legacy anti-pattern? Is that just the way it is? How do you think about that?
I think it's quite a legacy pattern for today's day and age, because there's so many other options, right? In terms of right from, even if you want to go old school, there with an availability group, for example, you can have a readable secondary. So you should be realistically offloading all your reporting queries, for example, to that secondary. You should never realistically be touching the production server. And what with all the various flavors of Azure SQL and Azure Managed Instance, and if you go for the business critical on an Azure Managed Instance, for example, you get suddenly got access to one of those, the 3 or 4 nodes that exist already in a read-only mode, and that's for a business, with a 3 or 4 second delay, sort of latency with your data sync. I think that's such an amazing thing to be able to just go, we don't even need to touch production anymore, right? We can just, get all of our data from here, because I can't see anybody needing data that's less than sort of 5 seconds, old, really. So
right.
Tools like that, I think, are awesome for production workloads, and just maintaining that the data is available when the client needs it or when the customer needs it, and it's available fast, right?
Yeah. And you brought up a good point with Azure kind of changing how they host SQL Server, and so many teams just assuming, oh, I'm just going to put this in Azure. It's going to be easier that way, and so therefore my SQL Server is going to be in Azure. You mentioned the managed instance. What are the big flavors of how to host your SQL Server, and why would you choose the various flavors?
Yeah, I think so. I've always found that if it's a brand new application you're developing or building from scratch, I would always opt for the Azure SQL database, realistically, because you don't have any of the hangups from that you're trying to bring across from on-premise or a VM or anything like that. You've got a clear field, a greenfield environment to build. And of course, there are certain workloads where that won't be relevant. You might need specific IOPS, for example. There might be a vendor requirement, which I've got something to talk about actually on that, about vendor lock-ins. But there might be a specific vendor requirement where you need IOPS, for example. So that might not be. But most cases, I find if you're greenfield, I'm building a new application, Azure SQL database has really done wonders for the situations I've been in. If you're trying to get into Azure, for example, from on-premise or hosted VMs, I'm a massive fan of Azure managed instances. I think they are an amazing halfway house to starting to utilize some of the cloud capabilities. I have also seen, speaking of anti-patterns, I've also seen a common pattern that happens with many of the clients I've worked in the past, is they will actually try and do almost on-premise in the cloud. So they know what they've got. They've got everything on their hosted VMs, and they just create and lift and shift those VMs into Azure, which is kind of, you're in the cloud, but you're not taking any advantage of any of the amazing features and functions you got available to you now, really, because you've still got to think about backups, you've still got to think about Windows updates and all that stuff that I find quite, arduous, and they're repetitive in nature, so they can get a bit long-winded at times. So that's such a common thing I've seen, and I've always tried to guide clients into, it's more work up front, right, to get something a bit more cloud native, but that's why you're doing it, to get there and take advantage of all the great features out there.
Is there any kind of metric that people should be using to know if they're spending too much on their Azure SQL instance? We have that slider bar to scale up and add more cores and all that. And of course, that comes with a cost. And I think so many of us, and I personally, wrestled with looking at, how much it's costing to run that database and thinking, okay, it feels like that's too much for what I've got going on. Where do I look now to test that hypothesis? Maybe I need to adjust something so that, I don't know, maybe I need fewer cores for what I'm actually doing. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I've always guided our clients is to go slightly higher than what they are coming from, because I've done a lot of my career regarding migration work, so taking large workloads from on-premise or hosted VMs into Azure. And one thing I would always recommend to our clients is to go slightly higher than what you had on. So if you've got, 16 cores and 32 gig of memory over here, I would recommend you go slightly higher over here, and same for disks and throughput and whatnot. I would always recommend you go slightly higher and then bring it down over time, because once you're there, you can start to take advantage of great tools within Azure, such as the Advisor and things like that against the database, which will actually tell you if you are over-provisioned, for example, and tell you if you are under-provisioned. So I would always advise our clients to go slightly higher, because things don't work on a one-to-one basis when you've got, you can't just say, well, I've got all these resources over here, so if I just copy them and have the same in the cloud, or as close as I can get to it, I'm sure it'll be fine, because very often things like storage, there's a lot more latency on the storage, for example. So you have to be mindful of these things. And once you're there, then you can start to utilize some of the tooling from Azure Monitor and the Advisor and whatnot, just to help you fine tune your costings. And I think some of the costing tools, I'm not as experience with the costing side of things within Azure, but from what I do know, I think it's really cool, and the tools that are there to help, just try and make sure it's cost efficient while you're there.
What's your thought process on databases that never lived anywhere except Azure SQL, where there's no previous baseline?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one thing I would just do is keep an eye on your Azure Monitor and keep an eye on your analytics workspace metrics that are there. I mean, there's some really cool KQL queries that are out there from the community for getting these sort of baselines together, because I can't think of any of the particular names off the top of my head, but there's a few people I follow on LinkedIn that are just live and breathe KQL, and they've got some really cool scripts. There's so much out there in the community for understanding if you are facing pressure on those sort of databases, and that's before you even start looking internally, right? Once you start looking internally, you can see things like wait types within your instance, within the database, for example. So if you are waiting on a particular wait type all the time, so that's just building up over time, you can start to address that. But in my experience, it's always been the other way around. People under provision first, and then we have to start fine tuning from there. That's been the common one, because everybody's got to try and make a profit right at the end of the day, and they can't just realistically go, well, I'm just going to give it way too much resource and we'll fix it later. It's that everything's on a budget, and that's fair enough, because businesses have got to maintain their sort of stature in that respect.
You said KQL. You speaking of the Kusto query language?
Correct, yeah.
I think there's quite a few .NET developers out there who, because of the organization, they literally are their own DBA, and they've put database in SQL, and they've never even heard of KQL. Can you give a quick overview of why they should look into it and use it?
It's excellent for interrogating logs and monitoring within Azure, basically. So if you've got enough monitoring enabled and turned on, you'll have what's called an analytics workspace. So that's where all your logs go to, and then you can query, and you can do amazing things in there, like correlate this event happening with this event, and this. You can just bring it all together using, and you can query that information in one place using KQL. And it's one of the reasons I love Azure, because just the tooling there, once you're in there, there's so much work gone into these tools, and you can tell, you can really tell. It's by people who understand what you're looking for very often. And I've worked with site reliability engineers, and there's one that springs to mind who were like wizards with these tools. I mean, I know my way around, but I'm not an expert in them. But I've worked with people who can bring together all these different data sources and put data points and actually build a comprehensive picture about what happened with our environment at 2 a.m. last night. And that's a real skill in itself, I think.
Yeah. An analogy that I think is appropriate is regular static analysis for code, where in our build, we run the Roslyn analyzers for .NET or Independ or SonarQube or some of the linting tools for JavaScript or TypeScript, because it looks at things and finds things that are probably going to be problems for us and we need to address it. And then you got these tools that look at the past behavior, could be recent past behavior of what has actually happened in the database, and pulls out, what? These things are likely problems. You might want to think about them.
Yeah, you have to, and that's why I think it's a skill in itself. And like I say, there's one site reliability engineer that I used to work alongside in quite a hybrid team, and she was kind of incredible at how she could pull together all these data points and then build a picture about all these different events that happened. And, this particular procedure timed out, which meant this front end screen timed out, which caused a knock-on effect with this other thing. And it's very much a detective game at that point. You got to get your Sherlock Holmes hat on and start to really dig deep and understand how and why and what.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in my introduction, I mentioned your website, leebrownhill.com, and you've got a blog there. We'll put it in the show notes. But if we encourage the listeners to go check out your website, what are they going to find?
topics, mostly technical topics that I blog about. So if I find something where I've had to explain it to a colleague, or if I find something that I've had to go, I have no idea about this situation right now. I've had to go away and really learn and understand the situation. And if I find something cool and interesting and I think that'll be good to do a blog post, anything like that will go on there realistically. And I've done a few series, and I'm just started a new series actually on there, which is about learning SQL 2025 and specifically the new features, because like all of us, we're all busy, and I haven't realistically had time yet to sit down and understand these new features to the level I'd like to, and I'm probably going to need to in the future. Anything like that, I find it an incredible tool for learning and making sure things get stuck in my head, because if you're going to put something out there on a blog, you want to make sure it's obviously technically accurate and correct. So anything that I find interesting or that I've had to go away and learn myself will go on there. And yeah, there's been some unit testing series that I've done on there regarding T-SQL, because unlike a lot of other programming languages or languages in general, everybody else seems really good at writing their own unit tests. Not so much in the SQL world, in my experience. It's kind of like an afterthought. So I'm a big advocate for T-SQL, which is an open source framework for unit testing stored procedures within SQL Server, or any code realistically within SQL Server. And it gives you a repeatable mechanism that you can then start to integrate into your pipelines and whatnot. So I used to work at a financial software as a service company, and we had to start using T-SQL because we realized we had no unit testing on our SQL code, which at the time took up probably a third of our code base. Yeah, my .NET colleagues all over there are perfect. They're just part and parcel. Everything they ship, it's got associated unit tests. But it was quite a new thing, and at first it felt like quite an arduous task, but it really saved our bacon so many times. So yeah, but yeah, going back to the blog, there's all sorts of technical content on there, and there's also any sort of performances or podcasts or shows I've attended, like your show yourself. There's a little archive building up on there now where people can see other shows I've done.
One of the things you discussed on your site was Redgate SQL Cop.
Yes,
and that has caught my eye, because the notion of just built-in database tests, I think,
fantastic.
So for people who've literally never looked at that type of thing, can you give us a quick synopsis of why they may want to check it out?
Yeah, so the good folks at Redgate, who do amazing work for the data platform world, they have a tool called T-SQL. As part of that, you can download what they call their SQL Cop tests. You can literally just run these, and it will deploy them to the database of your choosing. And then you can just run them, and it will tell you all those anti-patterns and all those bad practices that we see so often, if they are present, if they need attention, and how to fix them, and things like that. So it's kind of like a tool bag of just sort of, they're good to go tests that you can run quite easily, anybody with minimal sort of database or SQL experience. And it'll give you guidance about, oh, you probably should change this, you should probably change this, you should probably change this. And they are very key, important items that they will flag. So yeah, it's if you're a small shop with not much database skill settings in-house, I would definitely recommend visiting Redgate and getting those tools.
And just looking at some of those inspections, which is really, it's static analysis. One of the tests is looking for columns that have spaces in them, which, yes, is allowed, but then you got to put brackets everywhere, and if you forget them, then there's problems. That one stands out to me.
Awful, not safe for work database names. I mean, it's just people get really creative with that stuff sometimes.
Yeah. And then some of the basics, like it looks for tables that somehow don't have a primary key.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, duh. But unless there's an inspector that happens somewhere, well, then it's just left to what a human has to find it at some point.
I totally understand how it happens, because there will be stakeholders who say we need X, but don't necessarily know the skill sets that are needed alongside that particular tool that's being brought in or that particular technology. So I understand how it happens, and it happens so frequently. And it's kind of why I think people like me exist, really, in the consultant world, just to help people in those situations because some things you can kind of work out yourself, and you can learn, and blah blah blah. But some people perhaps don't have the time to do that. Some people don't perhaps have the inclination to do that, and that's understandable because we all can get out of our depth pretty quickly at times in the world we live in today. So,
right.
It's easily done.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a book. Was it Douglas Crawford, the JavaScript book, The Good Parts? It was a book. Basically, the JavaScript language is pretty wide, and it was a book that says, okay, only use this part of the JavaScript language because all the other stuff leads to problems. And so this, I'm looking at the list of built-in tests in Redgate SQL Cop. It very much makes me remember that with SQL Server and T-SQL, you can do a lot of things. You can create that table without a primary key. You can use cursor. You can put spaces in table names, but none of those things have proven out to be good ideas. So let's just not do that, okay?
Yeah, I'm a big. I've been a big advocate for Redgate for a long time because they've had the DBA's world back for a long time in that sense, and they've had a lot of great free tooling. Obviously, they have some of their flagship paid products as well, which are fantastic from a monitoring point of view. But they've done a lot for the database world for sure.
Yeah. Well, Lee, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed diving into it. I feel we could talk for quite a bit. But as we leave, is there any a final bit of guidance or a final word before we close out?
I would just say, just going back to those best practices, really. Before making decisions around the database world, just try and be informed and be curious, and there's nothing wrong with asking for help.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, and I appreciate it. The listeners do as well.
Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
Oh, my pleasure. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure and DevOps podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Visit our sponsor, ClearMeasure, at www.clearmeasure.com. And on behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.